Hey everyone, did you know that over 90% of you watching right now haven't hit that subscribe button yet? If you're enjoying our stories about real-life gangsters, take just a second to subscribe. It's free, and it really helps us keep bringing you more true gangster tales every day. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into another story from the world of the mob. The first time Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero saw the ocean, he was 8 years old and already certain he'd never be ordinary. The waves rolled in like moving glass, crashing against the pier, and he told his mother, "Someday, Ma, I'm gonna be somebody people talk about." She laughed, thinking it was childish bravado. But even then, Lefty's eyes had that quiet burn, the kind that belonged to a kid who didn't want to blend in with the crowd. Years later, he was still staring at water. Only now it was the East River, dirty and glittering under the New York moon. And he wasn't a kid anymore. He was a soldier in one of the most dangerous families in America, the Bonannos, and the life he'd chosen was both everything he'd dreamed of and nothing like he expected. That night in the early 1970s, Lefty stood by the river with a cigarette in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. His suit was wrinkled, his tie loose, and his face looked older than his years. A black Cadillac idled behind him, headlights dim, engine humming low. From the shadows came a voice. "You know, Left, you ought to stop standing out here like a philosopher. People are gonna think you're soft." Lefty smirked. "If they think that, they don't know me." The voice belonged to Tony Mira, his longtime friend, and sometimes headache. Tony was one of those men who thought the world owed him everything. Loud, proud, always looking for an angle. But Lefty had known him since they were kids running numbers on Mulberry Street. They'd come up together, survived together, and bled together. Tony joined him at the railing, looking over the water. "You hear what they're saying about Sunny Red?" he asked. Lefty took a slow drag of his cigarette. "I hear plenty. Half of it's nonsense." "It ain't nonsense," Tony said, lowering his voice. "He's making moves. Quiet moves. People say he's lining up crews, trying to take the top spot." Lefty turned his head slightly. "Then people should mind their business. The minute you start chasing whispers, you stop watching the real threats." Tony sighed, exhaling into the cold air. "You always were the cautious one, and you always were the loud one," Lefty said with a faint grin. "Guess that's why we still balance each other out." The two men stood there in silence for a while, each lost in thought. Lefty wasn't afraid of danger, not anymore. What he feared was disrespect, betrayal, the cracks that formed inside a family when greed took over loyalty. He'd built his life on the idea that a man's word meant something, and now as the city changed, he was starting to wonder if that idea still had a place in it. Later that night, Lefty met up with the crew at a small cafe on Grand Street. It wasn't the fancy kind of joint, just a hole-in-the-wall spot where maid guys drank espresso and talked business under the hum of neon lights. Donnie Brasco was there too, a quiet guy, new to the crew, introduced by Sonny Black. He wasn't flashy, didn't brag, didn't try too hard. Lefty liked him instantly. "You got good instincts," Lefty told him the first night they talked. "That's rare. Most people talk themselves into trouble before they even know what's going on." Donnie smiled, modest but sharp. "I just listen more than I speak." "That's why you're still around," Lefty said, clapping him on the shoulder. The two became close quickly. Donnie would drive Lefty around, listen to his stories, ask questions that showed real respect, the kind Lefty hadn't felt in years. To Lefty, the kid was loyal, smart, and disciplined, like a younger version of himself. He took him under his wing, showing him the ropes, teaching him the subtle art of survival in their world. Over time, Lefty started trusting him more than anyone else. He'd invite him to dinners, introduce him to people, even talk about family, which was rare for him. "You know, Donnie," he said one night over whiskey, "I've been in this life over 30 years. 30 years. You think I got rich? No. You think I'm powerful? Not really, but I got one thing. I got respect. That's what matters. That's what lasts." Donnie nodded, And Lefty went on, his voice calm but edged with truth. You make your bones in this thing. You do what's asked of you. You keep your mouth shut. You give your loyalty, you expect loyalty back. That's how it's supposed to work. Only problem is, these days, half the guys in this life forgot what loyalty even means. Lefty stared into his drink, the amber light reflecting in his eyes. I seen good men get thrown away because somebody wanted a bigger cut. I seen rats ruin entire families. But you remind me of the old days. You got heart. Donnie smiled again, quiet as always. You taught me everything I know. Lefty chuckled. Yeah, well, let's hope you only learn the good stuff. For all his hard edges, Lefty wasn't cruel. He believed in codes, unwritten ones that governed how a man lived. You showed up, you paid your dues. You didn't double-cross anyone who trusted you. He didn't care if the world outside called it crime. To him, it was honor in a different language, but that didn't mean life was easy. The money never stayed long, the FBI never slept, and the streets were always shifting. Still, Lefty moved through it all like a man born for the storm, not because he loved it, but because he knew no other way to live. One cold December night, he sat with Donnie in a diner in Queens. The jukebox played Sinatra low in the background, the kind of music that made the night feel both endless and fragile. You ever think about what it's all for? Lefty asked suddenly. Donnie looked at him. What do you mean? I mean, all of it. The life, the rules, the fear, the respect. You spend your whole life trying to build something that don't exist outside your own name. You ever think maybe we're just ghosts waiting to happen? Donnie didn't answer right away. Maybe. But if you believe in something, even if it's not perfect, that's still something. Lefty smiled faintly. You talk like a philosopher. Careful or people will start thinking you're soft. They both laughed quietly, and for a moment the world didn't seem so heavy. When they left the diner, snow had begun to fall. Soft, silent, pure. Lefty stood under the streetlight, the flakes landing on his shoulders, melting into the warmth of his coat. He looked around, the city alive, humming, restless, and he thought about how far he'd come from that boy on the pier. He had dreamed of being somebody people would talk about, and now they did. Maybe not the way he imagined, maybe not for the reasons he hoped, but he was somebody. And as the night swallowed the sound of their footsteps, Lefty Ruggiero, tough, loyal, weary, and proud, walked on, unaware that the friendship he'd built with Donnie would one day become the story that defined not just his life, but the end of an entire era. The winter of 1979 was cruel in New York, the kind of cold that got into your bones and stayed there. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero had seen a lot of winters, but this one felt different. Maybe it was age catching up with him, or maybe it was the feeling that the streets he once ruled with quiet certainty were starting to shift beneath his feet. The old rules still existed on paper, but fewer and fewer people seemed to remember them. He sat at a small cafe on Mulberry Street, steam rising from a chipped cup of espresso, cigarette smoke curling above his head. Across from him sat Donnie Brasco, looking like any other street guy. Leather jacket, calm eyes, that silent confidence that Lefty liked. You see, Donnie, Lefty said, stirring his coffee slowly. This life, it's all timing. You move too slow, you miss your shot. You move too fast, you trip over yourself. You gotta learn to walk the line, just close enough to danger that you get respect, but not so close you get buried. Donnie nodded, taking mental notes like always. So how? Do you know where the line is? Lefty smirked. You don't. That's the trick, you just feel it. You make mistakes, and if you're lucky, you live long enough to learn from them. He leaned back, letting out a long breath. His voice softened a little. I made plenty of mistakes, kid. But one thing I never did, I never sold out a friend. You don't do that in this life. That's the one thing that separates a man from a coward. Donnie looked at him carefully. There was something in Lefty's tone, an old pain. something that hinted at betrayals long past. Someone sell you out before? Lefty gave a small, bitter laugh. Ain't that the story of this town? You give your loyalty, you give your time, your blood, and one day you find out the guy you trusted the most was counting your money behind your back. Happens to everyone, Donnie. That's why you gotta keep your eyes open. Donnie sipped his coffee, silent, letting the words hang in the air. To most men, Lefty was a relic, a soldier from another generation, still chasing the idea of honor in a world that had traded it for greed. But to Donnie, there was something real about him, something almost noble. He was rough, sure, impatient, blunt, often angry. But under it all was a man who believed in a code, and that made him different. Over the next few months, Donnie became a fixture in Lefty's life. He was there for everything: meetings, pickups, collections, quiet dinners in back rooms where whispers meant more than money. Lefty introduced him to people, vouched for him, trusted him. In a world where trust was currency, that meant everything. One afternoon, they were driving through Brooklyn in Lefty's old car. The radio was playing Sinatra, and the sun was breaking through gray clouds. Lefty was in one of his rare, talkative moods. "You know why they call me Lefty?" he asked. Donnie grinned. "Because you're a southpaw?" Lefty laughed. "Nah, kid. It's 'cause I lost everything I ever owned betting on a left-handed fighter. One night in the 50s, I had 20 grand, every dollar I'd ever saved. I put it all on this guy who was supposed to be the next champ. He gets in the ring, takes 2 punches, and goes down like he's taken a nap. Just like that, gone. I lost everything. So from then on, they started calling me Lefty. Lefty Two Guns, Lefty the Gambler, Lefty the Fool. Take your pick." Donnie chuckled, but Lefty's eyes had that faraway look again. "Funny thing is, I didn't mind the name. 'Cause you know what? I came back. I made it back from nothing. That's the thing about this life. You fall, you get up. You fall again, you get up again. But you don't cry about it. You take it on the chin and you keep moving." He glanced at Donnie. "You got that in you, kid. You don't quit easy. I like that." Donnie smiled faintly, though there was a flicker of guilt behind his eyes, a guilt Lefty would never notice. Weeks passed, and their bond grew stronger. Lefty started trusting Donnie with more responsibilities. He took him to meetings with Sonny Black Napolitano, the man who was becoming one of the most respected figures in the Bonanno family. Sonny liked Donnie too, and soon the kid was everywhere, from sit-downs in Queens to poker games in Little Italy. One night after a long day, Lefty and Donnie sat on a stoop in Brooklyn, passing a bottle between them. The air smelled like rain and gasoline, and the city buzzed quietly around them. "You know what I think sometimes?" Lefty said. "I think maybe this life ain't about making it big. Maybe it's about how long you can last without losing who you are. Guys come in, get greedy, think they're invincible. But the smart ones, the ones who really understand, they know it's all temporary. All of it. The money, the respect, the power. One day you're on top, the next day you're in the dirt." He paused, taking another swig. "But if people remember your name with respect, even if it's just a few people, that's enough. That's all I ever wanted." Donnie looked at him, the streetlight flickering over Lefty's weathered face. "People already respect you, Lefty?" Lefty shrugged. "Maybe. But you know what? Respect fades fast when you stop making money. That's the rule. That's why I keep hustling. A man who stops moving in this life, he's already dead." There was silence between them for a moment. The kind of silence that only existed between two men who understood how fragile the world around them really was. That night, as Donnie dropped Lefty off at his apartment, the older man turned to him and said quietly, "You ever need me day or night, you call. I don't care where I am or what I'm doing. You're my guy now, Donnie. You're one of us." Donnie nodded, smiling, but inside the words cut deep. Because he knew something Lefty didn't, that everything about him, every story he told, every moment they shared, was built on a lie. And though Donnie Brasco was an FBI agent undercover, a part of him, a small aching part, wished it wasn't true. Because Lefty Ruggiero wasn't just another mobster to him anymore. He was a man, flawed, proud, loyal, who had given him his trust. And that trust, once broken, would come at a price neither of them could escape. By the spring of 1980, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero and Donnie Brasco were inseparable. To anyone watching from the outside, they looked like the perfect team. The seasoned old-timer and the sharp young protege, running schemes from Manhattan to Brooklyn, always one step ahead. But beneath the easy rhythm of their partnership, invisible cracks were forming, ones that neither of them could see coming. The city was changing fast. The mob's hold wasn't as tight as it used to be. Drugs, greed, and new faces were rewriting the rules. The streets that once bowed to names like Bonanno, Colombo, and Lucchese were now littered with cowboys, young guys with no patience for respect or restraint. Lefty saw it all, and it gnawed at him. One night, he and Donnie sat in the back of a smoky bar in Little Italy. The lights were dim, the air thick with conversation, the kind of place where secrets traded hands faster than money. Lefty leaned forward, voice low. "You notice it too, right?" he said, tapping ash into a tray. "These kids coming up, they don't got discipline, they don't got respect. They think they're gangsters because they carry a piece and drive a Cadillac. They don't even know what it means to earn it." Donnie nodded. "It's like they want the glory." By the summer of 1980, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero felt like the world was spinning faster than he could keep up. The streets of Little Italy were changing. New faces, new rules, and new dangers that didn't play by the old codes he'd lived his whole life by. The days of quiet sit-downs and gentlemen's deals were fading. Now, it was about who could grab the biggest piece before the next guy did. But Lefty still walked the same route every morning, from his apartment down to the corner cafe. He'd nod to the same shop owners, wave at the same neighborhood kids, and stop at the same newspaper stand. Routine was his anchor in a world that no longer cared about tradition. One morning, Donnie Brasco joined him for coffee. The kid looked tired, like he hadn't slept much. Lefty noticed it immediately. "You all right?" he asked, lighting a cigarette. Donnie nodded. "Yeah, just been thinking a lot lately." Lefty smirked. "You think too much, kid. Thinking's dangerous in this life. You start thinking, you start doubting, and when you start doubting, you make mistakes." Donnie smiled weakly. "You ever doubt anything, Lefty?" Lefty took a slow drag and stared out the window. "Every damn day, but I learned to keep it quiet. You start saying your doubts out loud, people start listening. And in this business, you never know who's listening for the wrong reason." The waitress came by, dropped off 2 coffees, and disappeared. Lefty leaned closer. "You're good, Donnie. You got what it takes, but you gotta remember, loyalty's not just about who you shake hands with, it's about what you keep inside. That's what separates us from the punks out there." Donnie nodded again, his guilt twisting deeper. That afternoon, they went to see Sonny Black in Brooklyn. The Bonanno family was in a strange place. The old leadership was shaky, new alliances were forming, and whispers of internal cracks were everywhere. Sonny Black, calm and measured, was trying to hold it all together. Lefty respected Sonny. He wasn't flashy. He didn't make noise. He handled business with quiet strength. Inside the dim back room of a club, Sonny was sitting at a small table, going over envelopes with 2 other men. He looked up when Lefty and Donnie entered. "Left," Sonny said with a grin. "Heard you and your kid here are making good moves." Lefty nodded proudly. "He's solid, Sonny. Kid's got a good head. Doesn't talk too much, doesn't try too hard, just does what needs doing." Sonny motioned to Donnie. "That's what I like to hear. We need more guys like that. Not these hotheads who think they're gangsters after one score." Donnie smiled politely, shaking Sonny's hand. They talked business for a while, collections, territory, and the usual balancing act that came with keeping the peace between crews. But after the meeting, as they stepped outside into the humid night air, Sonny pulled Lefty aside. "You trust this kid?" he asked quietly. Lefty frowned slightly. With my life. Sonny studied him for a moment, then nodded. All right, keep him close. I might have something bigger for you both soon. Lefty didn't ask questions. In their world, questions could look like doubt, and doubt was dangerous. A few weeks later, that something bigger came in the form of an introduction. Sonny wanted Lefty and Donnie to meet some heavy hitters connected to new operations. It was a sign of trust, a move up the ladder. For Lefty, it meant validation after years of grinding without glory. For Donnie, it meant deeper infiltration, deeper risk. That night before the meeting, Lefty stood in front of the mirror, tightening his tie. His hands were rough, his face tired, but his eyes still had that flicker of pride. You see, kid, he said to Donnie, you stick around long enough, you earn it. These guys, they notice when you put in the work. That's how you build your name. Donnie adjusted his jacket, his heart pounding for reasons Lefty could never guess. You ever think about what happens when you're done with this life? He asked. Lefty chuckled. Done? Ain't no done, kid. You don't retire from this life. The only way out is in a box or in cuffs, if you're unlucky. That's just how it is. There was a strange stillness after that, as if both men were hearing something different in the silence. The meeting went smoothly, but tension was everywhere. Rival factions in the family were making moves, and federal eyes were watching. Rumors were spreading about bugs in clubs, secret informants, and taped conversations. Lefty brushed it off at first. We're ghosts, he'd say. They can't touch us if we don't make noise. But even ghosts leave footprints, and the FBI was getting closer. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Lefty and Donnie sat on the hood of the car, sharing a smoke. The city buzzed below them, unaware of the quiet war being fought in its shadows. Lefty turned to him suddenly. You ever wonder what people will say about you when you're gone? Donnie looked at him. Sometimes. Lefty nodded slowly. Me too. I think about it a lot lately. Maybe it's the age. Maybe it's the noise. But I just hope they remember I was fair, that I did what I had to do, but I never crossed the wrong line. He paused, eyes narrowing as if searching the skyline for something. You live long enough in this life, you start losing pieces of yourself, one friend at a time, one dream at a time. And one day, you look in the mirror and don't recognize the man looking back. The night breeze carried the sound of sirens somewhere in the distance. Lefty dropped his cigarette, crushed it under his shoe, and muttered, But we keep going, Donnie. That's what we do. 'Cause if you stop, you start thinking. And thinking, that's when the ghosts catch up. The two men stood there for a long time, watching the lights flicker across the city. For Lefty, it was another night in a lifetime of nights. For Donnie, it was another lie built on top of a truth he could never reveal. What neither of them knew was that the walls around them were already closing in. Wiretaps were recording, files were growing thicker, and agents in windowless rooms were piecing together a puzzle that would change both their lives forever. And somewhere deep down, maybe Lefty already felt it, that strange chill that comes before the fall. He just didn't want to believe it yet. By early 1981, the walls around Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero were starting to whisper. Whispers of wiretaps, whispers of rats, whispers that the old ways weren't safe anymore. But Lefty didn't believe in fear. He believed in routine. You woke up, you dressed sharp, you met your guys, you handled business. You didn't flinch. That's how he'd survived this long, by acting like nothing could touch him. Still, there were nights when he'd lie awake in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling fan spinning in the dark. His wife would be asleep beside him, and he'd think about the years gone by, the deals, the hits, the friends buried under fake names and real regrets. Sometimes he'd whisper to himself, was it worth it? And every time he'd answer, yeah, 'cause what else was I gonna be? That spring, Sonny Black was tightening his grip on his crew. He was steady, loyal, and smart, But the Bonanno family was tearing itself apart. Leadership changes, internal wars, and FBI pressure were cracking the foundation. And in the middle of it all, Lefty and Donnie Brasco and Mike were making real money. Scores that turned heads, the kind that made people talk. Sonny started bringing them into higher-level meetings. Not the corner guys anymore. Real players. It made Lefty proud, almost like a father watching his kid graduate. "You see, Donnie," he said one night over whiskey in the back of a dim club, "you earn your bones with sweat. Nobody gives you respect. You take it. And you've taken yours." Donnie smiled, but his heart sank. Every compliment felt like a knife twisting deeper. Every word of trust made his mission feel dirtier. He wasn't just playing a role anymore. He liked Lefty. He admired him. And he knew what was coming would destroy the old man completely. Weeks later, they were sitting in Lefty's car outside a restaurant on Mulberry Street. The air was heavy with humidity and silence. Lefty was watching people pass by, a cigarette hanging from his lips. "You ever think about what you'd do if this all ended?" Donnie asked carefully. Lefty gave a low chuckle. "End? You're funny. This life don't end. It just slows down till you stop breathing. That's when you're done." He turned to Donnie, his face lit by the ember of his cigarette. "But let me tell you something, kid. You did good. Whatever happens down the line, you'll be all right. You got the brains, the patience. You ain't like the other clowns." Donnie forced a smile, his throat tightening. He wanted to tell him the truth, to warn him, but he couldn't. One word, and everything he'd built, every year of undercover work, every piece of evidence, it would all collapse. And worse, Lefty would be dead within days. As the summer heated up, the FBI's case was nearly ready. Months of wiretaps, surveillance, and recordings had built an unshakable mountain of proof against the Bonanno family. The agents were preparing to pull Donnie out whether he was ready or not. But to Lefty, life went on as usual. He was excited. Sonny had just hinted that Donnie might be getting his button soon, becoming a made man. It was the highest honor in their world, something Lefty had dreamed of for the kid. They even went shopping for a suit. Lefty took Donnie to his tailor, insisting on paying for it himself. "Listen," he said, patting Donnie's shoulder. "When they open the books, you gotta look sharp. Respect starts with how you walk into a room." Donnie nodded, barely holding himself together. That same night, the FBI made its move. They called him in. Operation Donnie Brasco was over. It was time to disappear. Donnie begged for one more chance to warn Lefty, one conversation, but the Bureau said no. It was too risky. The family would find out soon enough, and anyone connected to him would be marked. Still, Donnie couldn't let it go. He called Lefty one last time. "Left," he said softly. "I just wanted to say thanks. For everything. You were like a father to me." Lefty paused. "What are you talking about, kid? You sound like you're saying goodbye." Donnie swallowed hard. "Just take care of yourself, all right?" There was silence on the line. Then Lefty's voice, rough, suspicious. "Don't tell me nothing, Donnie. Don't say another word." Click. That was the last time they ever spoke. A few days later, headlines hit the news. FBI agent Joe Pistone had infiltrated the Bonanno crime family for 6 years under the alias Donnie Brasco. The mafia world exploded. Panic, rage, betrayal. Everyone was scrambling. Lefty heard the news in a small cafe. The waitress had a newspaper folded under her arm. When he saw Donnie's picture, his hand started to shake. He stared at it for a long time like he couldn't believe his eyes. The kid he'd trusted. The kid he'd vouched for. The kid he'd brought into his world. He didn't say a word, just folded the paper neatly, finished his coffee, and left a tip on the table. That afternoon, he got a call. "They want to see you, Left." He knew what that meant. There were no second chances for betrayal, even if he hadn't been the traitor himself. He got dressed carefully, pressed suit, polished shoes, gold ring. He fed his fish, patted his dog, and left his keys on the counter. Before walking out, he turned to his wife and said quietly, "If I don't come back, take care of yourself." Then he walked out the door. The FBI intercepted him before he reached the meeting spot. They picked him up on the street, placed him in protective custody. But something in Lefty's eyes was already gone. He didn't fight, didn't yell, just sat there staring out the window. "I should have known," he muttered. "The kid was too clean, too smart. But I wanted to believe. I needed to believe." They never let him go back to that life again. The mafia didn't forgive, and Lefty knew it. He spent his final years in small apartments, under watch, living quietly, alone with his memories. Sometimes people would ask him if he hated Donnie Brasco. He'd shrug and say, "Nah, he did what he had to do. We all did." And then, with a faint smile, he'd add, "He played me good, though. Gotta respect that." That's how the legend of Lefty Ruggiero ended, not with a bullet, but with a silence that said more than words ever could. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a villain. He was a man caught between loyalty and illusion, too loyal to walk away, too proud to admit he'd been fooled. And somewhere out there, the ghost of Donnie Brasco probably raised a glass in his honor, wishing things could have ended differently. After the fallout of the Donnie Brasco operation, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was a man without a compass. His name had been whispered in every corner of Little Italy, and none of those whispers were kind. He was the fool who brought a Fed into the family, the man whose loyalty had been used against him. In their world, that kind of stain never washed off. But Lefty didn't run. He didn't beg. He just existed. Quietly, slowly, like a machine that kept running out of habit even when the power had gone out. The FBI had kept him alive, barely. They scooped him up before he could walk into what would have been his own execution. They didn't want him dead. They wanted him contained. To them, he was a relic, one of the last old-school soldiers who still believed in the rules, even when the world around him stopped following them. They gave him a small place in Lower Manhattan under another name, a cramped apartment with peeling wallpaper and a view of a brick wall. To most people, it would have felt like prison. But to Lefty, it was just another kind of neighborhood, one where no one asked questions and no one cared about yesterday. He woke up early every morning, put on a clean shirt, and made coffee in silence. Then he'd sit by the window, reading the paper, scanning the crime section like a man checking his own obituary. Every so often, he'd see a name he recognized. An old friend found dead in a car. A rival caught in a raid. A boss sentenced to life. Each headline was a ghost knocking on his door. The FBI agents who checked on him didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't angry or bitter. He didn't curse them or the bureau. He just talked in that calm, gravelly voice as if the world was a play he'd stopped taking seriously. "You guys did your job," he told one of them once. "Can't knock that. I did mine too. Only difference is you're still working." The agent asked him if he missed the life. Lefty smiled faintly. "You don't miss the life. You miss the noise, the calls, the guys, the street buzz. One day it's gone, and you realize how quiet the world really is." There was something haunting in that statement, like he wasn't talking about crime, but about belonging. Because that's what it really was for him, belonging. The mafia wasn't just a job. It was a family, a church, a purpose. Without it, Lefty was just another aging man with no one to call and nowhere to go. Now and then, he'd wander into the old neighborhoods, wearing a hat pulled low, pretending to be just another retiree. He'd walk past the cafes and the butcher shops, the little corners where the old crew used to stand around smoking, laughing, whispering deals that would never make the papers. But everything had changed. The new faces were colder, flashier, more reckless. The codes had softened. The honor, the quiet respect. It was fading. One afternoon, he spotted a couple of young wannabes on the corner. They were loud, careless, bragging about scores that hadn't even happened yet. He shook his head, disgusted. Back in his day, you didn't talk, you earned. You didn't show off, you survived. He stopped by a cafe he used to frequent. The owner, an old friend named Vito, recognized him immediately. "Lefty?" he said quietly, glancing around. "I thought you were gone." "Nah," Lefty said with a smirk. "Takes more than bad luck to bury me." They sat down, had espresso, and talked about old times. But Vito could see it in Lefty's eyes. The spark was dimmer. The street that had once made him feel alive now made him feel invisible. Months passed, then years. Lefty's world kept shrinking. He didn't go out much anymore. He'd sit by the window staring out at nothing, chain-smoking while Sinatra played low on a dusty radio. He'd talk to himself sometimes, or to his fish tank. He still kept fish, just like he had back in the old days, feeding them every morning like clockwork. They were the only living things that still depended on him. He'd mutter to them softly, "You guys don't rat. You don't talk. You just swim. That's how it should be." In his mind, he'd replay the past. Not the crimes or the money, but the little moments. The laughs in smoky rooms. The meals shared with men who would later die for the same cause. The feeling of walking into a club and knowing everyone stood up out of respect. That was the drug he could never quit. Respect. In 1982, Sonny Black was found murdered, his body discovered in a garbage bag. Lefty heard about it from the evening news. He didn't cry. He just poured himself a drink and said quietly, he knew it was coming. Then he raised the glass and whispered, "To the last of the stand-up guys." He was one of the few left who still lived by that fading code. The old-timers used to say there were two ways to leave the life, in a coffin or in handcuffs. Lefty somehow avoided both, for a while, at least. By the late 80s, age and illness caught up with him. He was arrested on small racketeering charges but wasn't considered a major threat anymore. Even the prosecutors treated him like a relic, a man from another era. When reporters tried to talk to him, he didn't give them much. "You write what you want," he told one. "Just don't make me sound like some kind of saint. I ain't that." They asked if he regretted anything. He thought for a long time before answering. "Yeah," he said finally. "I regret trusting people who didn't earn it. But if I didn't trust, I wouldn't have had a life to begin with. So what can you do?" That was Lefty. Hard truths, no self-pity. He knew the world had moved on. The streets that once feared him didn't remember his name anymore. The code he'd lived by was a story now, told by men who'd never risked anything. But he didn't hate the new world. He just didn't belong to it. As the years wore on, his health failed. Lung disease, old wounds, time, all of it closing in. He spent his last days surrounded by a few family members and memories too heavy to carry. In the end, there were no headlines, no gunfire, no final showdown, just quiet. And maybe that's the irony. The man who spent his life chasing noise, loyalty, and respect ended his days in silence. But if you'd walked into that apartment near the end, you might have found him by the window. Faint music playing, whispering to himself like an old soldier reviewing his past battles. "I did what I had to do," he'd say. "And I stood tall. That's all that matters." For Lefty Ruggiero, that was the truth. Simple, unshakable, and final. The nights were the hardest for Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero. The world got too quiet after dark, and in that silence, the ghosts came back. He'd light a cigarette, stare out the window at the flickering streetlights below, and feel the weight of every decision he'd ever made pressing against his chest like an anchor. The city didn't care about old gangsters anymore. The papers had stopped writing about them. The young guys didn't know their names, and the life he'd once given everything to had turned into a myth people whispered about over cheap whiskey. Sometimes he'd think about Donnie, Joseph Pistone. He didn't call him that. In his head, he was still Donnie, the guy who sat with him in smoky bars, listened to his stories, laughed at his jokes, and asked questions like a kid trying to learn the ropes. He'd taught that guy how to survive, how to move right, how to talk like a man from the life. And all the while, the guy had been recording him, sending it all back to the feds. Most men in Lefty's shoes would have burned with hatred. But Lefty wasn't like most men. He had plenty of time to think, and the more he thought, the more complicated it got. One night, he said aloud, almost to himself, "The kid did his job. I can't hate him for that. Hell, he was good at it." He took a long drag of his cigarette and exhaled slow. "But he fooled me. That part hurts." He thought about what might have been different if he'd never met Donnie. Maybe he'd still be with the family. Maybe he'd have been gone long before, buried in some unmarked hole like the others. Either way, the story would have ended the same, with the life fading and the streets changing. What bothered him most wasn't that he got betrayed. It was that he got left behind. He used to be somebody, a made man, a trusted soldier, a guy people stood up for when he walked into a room. Now the only thing standing for him was the clock on the wall, ticking toward nothing. He'd go through his old box of photos sometimes, grainy pictures of the crew, laughing, eating, drinking. He'd trace their faces with his finger. Sonny Black, Bruno, Patsy, all gone. "They don't make guys like you anymore," he whispered. "Now they want the money, but not the code." One day he caught the end of a TV movie about the mafia. Some actor in a shiny suit was pretending to be a tough guy, talking about loyalty like it was a punchline. Lefty scoffed. "They think that's loyalty? That's show business," he muttered. "Real loyalty's quiet. It's sitting in a cell for a guy who forgot your name." He didn't talk much about his past, not even to his family. But when his grandson once asked him what it was like being in the mafia, Lefty chuckled. "Kid, it's like playing poker where everyone's cheating, but you still gotta smile and act like you don't see it." There were flashes of warmth, though. The neighbors liked him. To them, he was just an old man with sharp eyes and good stories. Sometimes he'd tell them cleaned-up versions of his life, stories about business meetings and partnerships that sounded almost normal. They had no idea who he really was. And he liked it that way. For once, he didn't have to look over his shoulder. But every so often, something would bring it all back. A headline about a new indictment, a name from the old days popping up, or a song on the radio, Sinatra especially, that could pull him straight back to Mulberry Street in the 60s. He'd sit there, eyes closed, remembering the smell of espresso, the sound of laughter mixed with tension, the sharp suits, the whispered deals. Back then, everything had a rhythm, even danger. Now, there was just silence. Still, he couldn't completely let go of the old rules. He still tipped big, always said sir and thank you, still carried himself like a man who'd earned respect the hard way. Even when his hands shook and his voice grew weak, there was something in his eyes, something that said, "Don't mistake kindness for weakness." As the years passed, Lefty's health declined. The doctors told him to quit smoking, but he never did. "What's the point?" he'd say. "I made it this far with these. Might as well finish the dance." He started keeping a little notebook. Not a confession. Lefty wasn't built for that. Just notes, names, memories. A quiet record of a life that most people would never understand. In one entry, he wrote, "I wasn't perfect. I wasn't a saint. But I stood by my word. And in my world, that was everything." He never let anyone read it. Then, one winter evening, the phone rang. It was someone from the old neighborhood, a kid who'd grown up hearing stories about him. "Lefty, you still around?" the voice said, half joking. Lefty chuckled. "I'm too stubborn to die, kid." They talked for a few minutes about nothing important. Sports, weather, the old days. When he hung up, he sat back in his chair and smiled faintly. For a moment, it felt like he was part of something again. That night, before bed, he looked at his fish tank. "You guys made it through another day," he murmured. "Guess we all did." The lights of the city glimmered outside his window. Somewhere, far off, a siren wailed. And Lefty, old and worn, but still standing, closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm still here." He didn't say it with pride or regret, just truth. The streets had forgotten him, the world had moved on, but in that tiny apartment, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero was still alive, still a soldier, even if the war was long over. And deep down, he knew one thing for certain. He had lived his life by a code that no longer existed, but at least he'd never betrayed it. That, for him, was enough. By the time Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero hit his late 70s, the man who once walked Mulberry Street with a pistol in his belt and the world at his feet was now moving slow, leaning on a cane, his lungs giving him trouble. The years had stripped him down, one layer at a time. First his crew, then his reputation, then his health. But the one thing time couldn't take from him was his edge. Even frail, Lefty had that look, the one that told you he'd seen everything, done everything, and wasn't impressed by much anymore. He lived quietly now, in a small apartment on the Lower East Side. No plaques, no souvenirs of his past life, just a worn recliner, a coffee table stacked with old newspapers, and a fish tank that hummed gently in the corner. The sound of the bubbling water was his company. It filled the silence that came after a lifetime of noise, sirens, engines, laughter, lies, and loyalty. His world had gotten smaller. A few neighbors would check in on him, usually to help with groceries or just to talk. They knew him as Mr. Ben, an old-timer who told great stories about back in the day. None of them really knew who he was, not the real him anyway, and that suited Lefty just fine. He didn't crave attention anymore. He'd had plenty of that in his time. What he wanted now was peace, something he'd never known when he was living under the code. But peace didn't come easy to a man like him. At night, when the city lights shimmered outside his window, he'd sit in that recliner, staring into the fish tank. "You guys don't know how good you got it," he'd whisper to the fish. "No rats, no bosses, no deals, you just swim." He'd chuckle to himself, take a drag from his cigarette, and cough until his chest hurt. Sometimes he'd talk to his reflection in the glass. "You did what you had to do," he'd tell himself. "You kept your mouth shut. You took the hits. Maybe that's all any man can do." There was no bitterness in his voice, just fatigue, the kind that comes from carrying too many years of regret. One day he got a letter in the mail. It was from someone he never expected, Joseph Pistone, the man the world knew as Donnie Brasco. The letter was short, respectful. It said, "I always respected you, Lefty. You were a man who lived by his word. I hope you're at peace." Lefty read it twice, then set it down. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. "You did your job, kid," he murmured. "I can't hate you for that." He didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. But for the first time in years, he felt something like closure. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. They'd both played their parts in a story that had burned too hot and too fast. Lefty spent his days in quiet routines. Morning coffee, a slow walk to the corner deli, a chat with the owner, who always slipped him an extra pastry. Then he'd return home, read the paper, and shake his head at the stories about the new kind of crime. Hackers, white-collar scams, politicians. He'd mutter, "Ain't nobody earning anymore. They just take." The world had changed beyond recognition. Loyalty didn't mean what it used to. Respect was measured in likes and headlines instead of silence and honor. The young men in sharp suits didn't scare him. They amused him. He'd seen too much to be impressed by flash. Sometimes he'd get calls from reporters wanting to capture the golden age of the mafia. He always turned them down. "You can't capture it," he'd say. "You had to live it, and most who did didn't make it this far." He didn't brag. He didn't preach. He just carried his past like a shadow that would never fade, no matter how dim the light got. In his last few years, illness caught up with him hard. His breathing worsened. The doctors told him to quit smoking. He just laughed. Kid, he told the nurse, if these cigarettes didn't kill me by now, they're on my side. One night, when the city was quiet and the moonlight poured into the apartment, Lefty sat by the window in his old robe, a cup of coffee in one hand, a cigarette in the other. He looked out at the skyline, went at the towers, the bridges, the endless lights, and said softly, "You know I loved this city, even when it didn't love me back." He thought about the people who'd come and gone, the old crew, Sonny Black, Donnie, the bosses, even the enemies, all of them part of one big, messy story. He wondered if they'd be remembered, if he'd be remembered. Then he shrugged. Doesn't matter. I know who I was. That's enough. A week later, his neighbor found him asleep in that same recliner, coffee cup still half full, Sinatra's "That's Life" playing low on the radio. He looked peaceful, maybe for the first time in decades. There was no fanfare, no final message, no headline in the paper. Just quiet. The city moved on, as it always does. The streets that once knew his name had forgotten it, and the world that once feared him had replaced him with newer stories. But for those who remembered, Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero wasn't just another gangster. He was a man who stood by his word, who faced the music without flinching, and who lived and died by a code that didn't bend, even when the world around him did. In the end, his greatest act wasn't the crimes he committed, but the loyalty he refused to betray. And maybe that's the quiet lesson in Lefty's story. You can lose everything, money, power, reputation. But if you keep your word, if you hold on to what makes you, you, then you've still won in your own way. The city lights flickered outside and the fish tank bubbled softly, keeping time with the rhythm of a man who had once lived loudly and finally learned the beauty of silence. Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero's story wasn't about glory, it was about endurance. And when he took his last breath, he did it standing tall in spirit, the same way he'd lived his life. After Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero passed, the news didn't make front pages. There was no parade of black Cadillacs, no long line of mourners in dark coats whispering over flowers. It was a quiet passing, almost invisible, just another name slipping through the cracks of New York's endless noise. But for a small circle of people, the ones who'd lived through the same smoke, sweat, and secrets, the word spread like a ghost through the city. A few old faces gathered at a modest funeral home in Little Italy. They stood by his coffin in silence, not out of sadness, but respect. Men who'd known the life, or at least brushed close enough to smell its danger, came to pay their respects to one of the last who truly lived by the code. They didn't talk about hits or rackets. They talked about small things, the way Lefty used to tip the waiter double or how he always ordered his espresso short, not swimming. One man, gray-haired with tired eyes, leaned over and whispered, he was the last of the real ones. And he wasn't wrong. Lefty's generation was gone. The days when honor meant something, when a man's handshake carried more weight than a lawyer's contract, those were over. The street was different now. The new breed didn't wear suits, they wore sneakers. They didn't earn, they hustled online. The silence was gone, replaced by noise. Every wannabe recording himself, chasing fame instead of respect. Lefty would have hated it, but death has a way of rewriting stories. As the years passed, whispers about him started to grow. The young ones, who never met him, who never saw him walk Mulberry Street, began to talk about Lefty the Loyal. Some said he was betrayed by everyone and still never folded. Others said he was the victim of a world changing too fast for men like him. The truth was somewhere in between, and maybe that's what made his story powerful. A journalist from Brooklyn, researching an article about the fading days of the old mafia, found Lefty's name buried in old FBI files. He started digging deeper. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became. This guy, he told his editor, wasn't some movie character. He was real, flawed, but real. He lived by his code even when it destroyed him. That article went viral. Suddenly people started talking about Benjamin Ruggiero again. not as a criminal, but as a symbol of loyalty in a world that had forgotten what it meant. Podcasts dissected his friendship with Donnie Brasco. Documentaries replayed grainy footage of him walking the streets, cigarette in hand, head held high. Everyone had a theory. Some painted him as a tragic hero. Others saw him as a cautionary tale. But no one could deny one thing. Lefty had lived his truth, even when the cost was everything. One afternoon, Joseph Pistone, the man who'd once been Donnie Brasco, sat down for an interview. He was older now, too, his voice softer, steadier. When the reporter asked about Lefty, Pistone paused for a long moment before speaking. "You gotta understand," he said. "Lefty was old school. You gave your word, that meant everything. He got dealt a bad hand, but he played it straight. I respected him for that. I always did." The interviewer asked if Pistone ever felt guilty. He smiled faintly. "In that life, everyone gets burned sooner or later. But Lefty, he was one of the few who didn't run when the fire started." That quote spread everywhere. Suddenly, even those who knew nothing about the Bonanno family or the old days of the mob knew the name, Lefty Ruggiero. Years later, a small film studio made a quiet documentary about his life. No Hollywood glitz, no dramatization, just interviews, photographs, and the truth, told plainly. The final shot was of his old apartment, the fish tank still bubbling faintly in the corner. The narrator said, "Some men are remembered for what they took, others for what they refused to give up. Lefty Ruggiero was one of the latter." When it aired, old-timers sat in their living rooms, watching in silence. A few nodded. Some wiped their eyes. They knew the feeling, the fading of an era, the quiet disappearance of a world built on unspoken rules. In Little Italy, a young man named Marco opened a small cafe not far from where Lefty used to walk. On the wall hung a framed photograph of a younger Ruggiero, cigarette in hand, smirking slightly at the camera. Beneath it, Marco wrote a quote. "Always keep your word, even if it costs you." When customers asked who the man was, Marco would say, "An old neighborhood legend. One of the few who meant what he said." Most didn't recognize the name, but those who did just nodded, smiling faintly. They'd tell their friends, "That's Lefty, the guy who never flipped." And so, in a way, Lefty found immortality. Not in fame, not in riches, but in whispers, in quiet admiration, in the fading memory of a world that once had rules, and the few men who followed them until the end. He became a story told at closing time, when the lights dimmed and old men nursed their final drink. A story about loyalty, regret, and the strange dignity of a man who never ran from what he was. His name might never be carved into marble or history books, but it lived in the rhythm of the streets, in the echoes of those who still believed that your word is your bond, and loyalty is the last currency worth having. As decades passed, New York continued to change. Towers rising where tenements once stood, tourists where soldiers once marched. But somewhere in the quiet corners of Mulberry Street, if you listened close enough, you could almost hear the shuffle of worn shoes and a raspy voice saying, "You play the hand you're dealt, kid, but you don't fold." Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero might have left the world quietly, but the legend of Lefty never really died. It lived in stories, in lessons, in the hearts of those who still respected a man who stood tall when everyone else bowed to fear. He became what few gangsters ever did, a symbol not of crime, but of character. And maybe, just maybe, that's the kind of immortality Lefty never expected, but always deserved. Years after Benjamin Lefty Ruggiero's death, New York moved on, as it always does. The city never stops for anyone, not even for men who once held its shadows in their hands. Yet somehow his name kept slipping through time like smoke. Not in headlines, not in movies, but in quiet stories, the kind passed between old-timers leaning against brick walls, reminiscing about the days when men like Lefty walked the streets with purpose. By the mid-2000s, Mulberry Street was almost unrecognizable. Trendy cafes had replaced the smoky social clubs, And instead of whispers about the life, you heard tourists asking where to find the best cannoli. But beneath that modern polish, pieces of the old world remained. Some said if you walked those streets late enough when the air was still and the city lights softened, you could almost feel the ghosts of the old days. And one of them always wore a brown suit, moving slowly, always looking over his shoulder, as if still watching for the next betrayal that never came. A young writer named Anthony stumbled across Lefty's story while researching for a book about loyalty. He'd grown up hearing his grandfather's tales about the old mob, the codes, the camaraderie, and the quiet tragedy of it all. But it was Lefty's story that stopped him cold. There was something painfully human about it. A man who gave his trust to the wrong person, who never stopped believing in loyalty even when it destroyed him. Anthony started digging through archives, interviews, and FBI transcripts. The deeper he went, the more he saw the contradiction that made Lefty unforgettable, the toughness of a gangster, and the heart of a man who just wanted respect. He found transcripts where Lefty talked about wanting to retire, wanting a quiet life with his family, maybe a small shop. But dreams like that didn't belong to men in his world. The streets never let you walk away clean. One night, Anthony visited an old neighborhood bar on Mott Street. The bartender was in his late 70s, white hair slicked back, hands trembling slightly as he polished a glass. When Anthony mentioned Lefty's name, the old man stopped mid-motion. "You knew him?" Anthony asked. The bartender smiled faintly. "Knew him? Kid Lefty used to sit right there in that corner booth. Every Friday night. Same drink, same seat. Said it was bad luck to change what worked." He poured himself a small glass and slid one across to Anthony. "You writing about him?" Anthony nodded. "Then write the truth," the old man said, his voice steady despite the years. "He wasn't no saint, but he wasn't no coward either. He got played by people he trusted, but he never cried about it, never pointed fingers. He just took it. That's rare these days." He paused, staring off as if seeing the ghost of an old friend. "You want to know what made Lefty different? He believed in honor, even when it stopped believing in him." Months later, Anthony's book hit the shelves. It wasn't a bestseller, but it struck a chord with the right people, the ones who understood what the story really was. It wasn't about crime or betrayal. It was about the last man standing in a world that no longer valued loyalty. The book's title was simple: The Last Gentleman of Mulberry Street. Within its pages, Lefty wasn't portrayed as a villain or a victim, but as a man trapped between two codes, the one he swore to follow, and the one the world forced upon him. Readers wrote letters saying the story made them think about their fathers, their uncles, their own promises broken and kept. One letter came from a retired police officer who'd spent years chasing mobsters. He wrote, "Funny thing, I hated what they did, but I respected how some of them lived. Lefty was one of those. He reminded me that even in darkness, there's such a thing as dignity." Meanwhile, in Brooklyn, an old man named Tony Boots sat on his porch, watching kids play ball in the street. He'd once been a small-time runner under the Bonannos, just a face, in the crowd. But he'd never forgotten the day Lefty gave him a folded 20 and said, "You got potential, kid. Don't waste it chasing ghosts like me." He still had that bill, pressed flat between the pages of an old prayer book. Every now and then, he'd open it, stare at the worn signature and mutter, "You were right, Lefty. You were always right." He watched the kids shouting and laughing and thought about how different the streets were now. The old codes were gone. The new generation didn't understand the weight of loyalty or the quiet pride of keeping your word. But maybe, just maybe, stories like Lefty's would remind them. A decade later, streaming platforms discovered his legend. A new docuseries called Loyal to the End featured Lefty as its centerpiece. It explored his bond with Donnie Brasco, his downfall, and the mystery of his final days. Unlike the old dramatizations, this one told the story through the lens of loyalty, trust, and the cost of being true to yourself. In the final episode, the narrator said softly, "Some men are defined by what they take from the world. Others, by what they refused to give up. Benjamin Ruggiero refused to surrender his loyalty, even when it cost him everything. That closing line became iconic. It was quoted on social media, printed on posters, whispered in podcasts. And just like that, the old street soldier who once slipped into obscurity became a symbol again. Not of crime,